Hello. Today I'm going to demonstrate the data exchange framework database provider that is included in Sitecore Foundation. Now, if you haven't looked into the data exchange framework, it's a nice little framework that Sitecore released around the time Sitecore 8.2 came out, and they're actually up to version 1.41 right now. But what it does is it gives you a standardized approach for how you can build integration routines to push or pull data to and from Sitecore. And they actually comes with providers for creating Sitecore items or creating or updating Sitecore contexts pretty much out of the box, but it leaves it up to you to build database providers to connect to your system to get data actually into your systems. In the tutorials for the framework, it actually shows you how to build a file provider. So what I'm going to demonstrate today is probably one of the more useful providers that we built, which is the database provider, which allows you to write any query to a SQL, EDB, or ODBC connection and have it flow right into Sitecore Items. Now, for the purposes of testing, I'm actually writing queries against the Contoso Retail Data Warehouse, which is a Microsoft sample data warehouse database that I just happen to have installed. I include the link to download and set it up if you wanted to do that in the wiki, in the resources page. But here you can see this is just the query we're actually going to use. I'm doing a top 50 because I don't want to create too many items. I do keep in mind I have tested this with buckets. It works with buckets fine. But for now, I'm not dealing with a bucketable item. So one of the things you need to do is actually define your template. And I actually have the test template for here in the database provider. And you can see it's just a simple Sitecore item template. And it just has the fields of the item, mostly single line text. And essentially what I want to do is load that query, and then in my content tree I have a global folder. I have a Contoso product folder set. Right now you can see there's nothing under there. And what we want to do is fill it with the items. So let's kick it off and I'll show you how it's actually put together and configured. And then after the demonstration it should be done, we can take a look at the products. So under data exchange we have a database tenant. And right now, all four tenants are in the project layer as the DXF project. But the actual providers and code behind that is actually implemented in the feature layer. So I am trying to follow Helix principles, although I was tempted to break these into 4 project level projects, but just for simplicity, keeping them together, because these are all samples for the different providers that we have, and I'll probably do videos on some of the other ones where they're interesting. So we do have a pipeline batch, and this kind of is the place where it runs the whole thing. So let me just kick it off. And from there, I'll kind of show you how it's actually, what it's actually doing, how it's put together. So the pipeline batch kicks off a pipeline, and the first pipeline it's going to kick off, let me expand this out so you can see it a little better, is the read database records from database query pipeline step. So we have a query database pipeline step, which is of the type of my custom database pipeline step. And you can see it's specifying an endpoint, which I'll show you in a bit, and a query. And here you really can create a new instance of this with any query you want, pointing to whatever endpoint you want. Our endpoint, here's our Contoso database endpoint, is basically 2 fields, a connection type, which right now is SQL, OLEDB, or ODBC, and a connection string, and this is just a dummy set for my local setup, so don't get too crazy that you know my Contoso password. I will say the implementation for connection types I did make extensible, where you register each type using a custom pipeline, a more traditional Sitecore pipeline that I've built. And I actually can point to a project that implemented their own connection type to support Oracle. So that is something that's easy enough to do if you need to support it. So it's going to run that query, and it's going to iterate the data and run the pipeline step. Another one I could show you actually have an alternate version of this pipeline step. So this one comes out of the box with the framework. I have one that will run each of the individual items asynchronously, because by default it's going to process each item, turn them into a Sitecore item one at a time sequentially. I mean, essentially this will run for each of the records return this pipeline, which audit dictionary just will log every field in it. Now, it's audit dictionary because, in the data exchange framework, you can really store your source and your target as objects and do whatever you want. Some of the samples use an item model, which is kind of a string object dictionary that's loosely based on a Sitecore item. I thought that it wasn't really appropriate to use that for database records, or and I just want to kind of standardize on something. So I standardized on a string dictionary with string keys and string objects. And essentially what I'm doing as I get the query, I'm opening up a reader, mapping each data row into a dictionary and yield returning it. And the reason I do that is I don't want to kind of hold everything in memory. I want to be able to stream it. And it's definitely something that's kind of important in thinking when building your providers. So this audit is just auditing all the fields that are actually going in there. So it's just useful if you're troubleshooting, especially if you're trying to do mappings and making sure you have the right keys and values. So what is important though is those value sets, since it's not standard or anything out of the box. These database actor sets or these keys, which are really just the column names of my query, are really the keys of a dictionary. And you can kind of use this anywhere. So if you build your own providers, wherever you get your data, whether it's a web service or you want to store it as a dictionary, then you can kind of make sure that whatever other processors you build can really understand and read out of it or cast it easily instead of using specific items. That's just a personal preference. All right, so anyway, so the audit just logs everything. Then the next thing is we're going to resolve the product. So this supports both adds or updates. So one of the first things we need to do is an existing item, what template it is. So here's my template. What the name is the product name. This is the endpoint we're using. The product key is the identifier value. We're getting it from the source. A bunch of settings. This is actually an out-of-the-box Sitecore pipeline step. Then comes our apply mappings. So if you're not that familiar with DXF, you basically define your fields on each level. Here's the fields of my template, and then you actually create a mapping set, which just basically for each of those fields say map this field to that field. The advantage being that you get to keep these things in Sitecore and you can change them and modify them and apply rules around them without having to redeploy code. And then finally, once it's mapped, we will update and save the item, and that just saves it to the database. So I'm hoping by now our batch is finished. And I could run it again, so it must mean it's done. But if we look here, here's our audit step is just really logging all the fields. And it's done that, and there should be about 50 items in there. So if we look under global, we should be able to come here and refresh this. Only 3 items. What did I do here? If I did all this and it errored out, I'm going to be pretty pissed. I thought I had a top 50 query, but maybe an error. Oh boy. You know what? I haven't seen that happen before. Let's just try to run it again, see if it works. Maybe it was just a connection issue. So you can see I kicked off 1016. still running. Of course, this happens when I'm recording a video. Let's see if it's actually working. Yeah, it's definitely working now. And just to see it actually finished. And it's all the more reason to make sure that you have mechanisms in place to monitor these things. You never know when you're going to get a connection related error. So this thing actually did complete, as you can see. It really took a minute. But just going at the end, 50 elements were iterated, so it actually did work. And if we come here, we'll get all the items. A lot of these are very similar variations, but you can see all the fields are mapped. That's really it. So hopefully you won't get too turned off on the fact that my connection didn't work the first time, but everything else should